Thanks so much, Beth. So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon, and I'm going to do a quick little introduction of our speaker this afternoon. I am joining you today from Cape Breton, and so as I give my little introduction and bio of Marjorie, you're gonna see your screen change a little bit because Marjorie's gonna share her screen with you and her presentation so that you'll be able to see exactly what it is we're talking about. So at this stage in her life, Marjorie Willison describes herself as a disruptor for seniors. Her education was in occupational therapy and in statistical ecology, but for most of her life, she's been active in 3 areas: community food security, the health impacts of urban planning, and housing for all. For several years, Marjorie was executive director of Shabukto Connections, a community development organization in Spryfield where she lives. And from that experience, she became a staunch advocate for collaboration within and between diverse sectors. She currently serves as a patient family advisor with the Provincial Quality Council for Continuing Care and virtual care team in mental health and addictions. Marjorie also serves as co-chair with the Deputy Minister of Seniors on the Advisory Council for SHIFT, Nova Scotia's action plan for an aging population. Marjorie also writes a blog at agingwellwithmarjorie.ca. Marjorie has received several awards throughout her life. Most recently, she was presented with an inaugural Vision Award, a joint initiative of the Canadian Academy of Geriatric Psychiatry and the Canadian Coalition for Seniors Mental Health. So thank you so much, Marjorie, for joining us today and being our speaker. We certainly are thankful that you're here. And as we go through the presentation, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end of our presentation that we'll be able to answer all of your questions. So I'll turn the floor to you, Marjorie.
Thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. So I frame loneliness as a public health issue because I think it is that important. And I am not progressing. Why am I not progressing with my slides? Okay, a different method. So I have 3 objectives for today's talk: broaden understanding of loneliness and its impact, to explore 3 levels of action to address loneliness. So I want to give you a flavor of the different levels, and to consider what you might do to make a difference. And you might wonder why the CBC garden lady is interested in loneliness. Well, it's because I've known loneliness. And also, I once heard Jeannie Ferguson, who's a geriatric psychiatrist, talk about the 3 curses of old age: boredom, dependence, and loneliness. And it's the loneliness one that scares me. So I'd like you to think about this presentation as one woman's journey to ward off loneliness. So I can think of loneliness as having 2 roots. One is, for some people, it's internal, it's a trait. And that could be because of a genetic link or early childhood. And when I was growing up, I loved my mom and my dad and my 3 brothers, and I always knew that they loved me. But at the same time, we were a family that kind of each went our own way. So I think I had some of that internal trait. It can also be external or situational, and that would be like becoming a widow or immigrating to a new country or living in poverty. Is terribly isolating, and people who are poor often feel they don't belong, or moving to a new location. And there are 2 aspects of loneliness, and I will come back to these from time to time. So I'd like you to remember them. So one is social loneliness, and that's just kind of who you know and who knows you. Do you just know one stratum of society, or do you know people in government, and you know people who live in poverty and everything in between? So that's the social loneliness piece. And then there's emotional loneliness. And I think that's what most people think of when they think about being lonely. And that's about feeling a sense of attachment to other people. And if you don't have it, you lack that not only that emotional closeness, but also the kind of support that can give. And this would show up as few or poor family relationships or no close friends. Or if you're in a crisis, there's no one to help you. And that's why in a lot of questions about social well-being, it might ask, how many people could you call on if you had an emergency? That's getting at that emotional closeness. So what about introverts? Being an introvert doesn't mean that you're lonely or shy or unsociable. I'm an introvert. Introverts like to spend time alone and gain energy being alone. I love it when, especially when the children were little and my husband and the kids would leave for an outing and I would have the house to myself. I was in heaven. And extroverts crave activity and people and gain energy being with others. And that's what my husband is like. Oh, he loves to be with other people and, you know, do things with other people. I mean, we do things together too, but it's just, we're a good pair. But, you know, as an introvert, I always felt that I didn't quite fit in because in our society, sociability is valued. And, you know, my husband's sociable, but I'm not particularly sociable. It's just who I am. But now this is how important social well-being is. So if you want to reduce your chance of dying, these are the things that matter. And notice the two at the top, the ones that have the biggest impact. Social integration, social involvement on multiple levels. Remember, that's the social ties piece. And strong relationships and social support. That's the emotional closeness and help and support. And that's more important than quitting smoking among people who have heart disease, more important than giving up heavy drinking, more important than exercise, more important than diet and nutrition, more important than treating hypertension. You get the idea that this is really, really important to our health. And yet as a public health issue, we're not giving it the attention it deserves. So why is this? Why does our social well-being matter so much? Well, it seems that there is an evolutionary link because our social attachment system shares the same part of our brains as the part for physical pain. So if you're lonely, you're in pain. And we're hardwired to be social beings. So if you wanted to survive on the grassland and pass on your genes, you stood a better chance if you lived with others. And look at us as a society. We live in villages and towns and cities. We are social beings. We need it. I want to talk about sense of belonging because people who are lonely often feel that they don't belong. And I like to think of it as you feel welcomed and needed, accepted by a group. You know, I had that feeling when I was invited to give this talk today, that I was welcomed and somewhat needed by all of you out there in the Alzheimer's Society. And it's based in what we value. And I like this. The capacity for solitude depends on the ability to preserve a sense of community while alone. So in other words, when I was getting this presentation ready, I had you people in mind and what I could say that would help you in whatever your particular situation is. So a lot of time to put this together and get through quite quickly. So that's that balance between alone time and social time. and I like this, if you are idle, be not solitary. If you are solitary, be not idle. So let's compare lonely with not lonely people. So our social skills are just as good. We dress as well. We're just as pleasant. We don't differ in personality traits, the 5 basic personality traits, from people who aren't lonely. But here's the difference. We maybe need more from others to feel truly connected and satisfied. You know, like you like to have heart-to-heart talks with people. Not a lot, but sometimes. They may feel lonely more quickly. They may feel lonely in more diverse circumstances. They may hold a mental vision of themselves as, you know, all alone in the world. Even if they have a lot of social ties, if they don't have that emotional well-being, then they may well feel very alone. And in today's world, we live in a very isolating social context. We have rampant individualism. You go to places like Japan and China and the Philippines, and the well-being of the group matters more than the individuals within the group. We have generations living apart from each other more and more. United Way of Halifax region has been tracking how many people live alone, and that number has been growing and growing and growing. In today's world, with both parents working or lone parents, it's harder to find the time to create and nurture social networks and spend time with family and friends. And, you know, these kinds of challenges have had a year-long spotlight on them because of COVID. It's put a magnifying glass on loneliness. And of course, ageism. Older people tend not to be as valued as young people in our society. So what are some of the impacts of loneliness? There are physical impacts. So higher blood pressure, problems digesting food, a lot of stress, so raised cortisol levels, being 3 times more likely to develop a heart condition if you're lonely. There are cognition and intelligence impacts, so loss of vocabulary. I mean, we all lose words now and again, but this is much bigger loss of vocabulary. A memory that you can't really trust. If you're with a group and there's a discussion going on, you have a lot of trouble following the discussion. If you're a lonely person, remember, because you're focused on other things, on like social cues. And so of course, we think of the social impact of loneliness, but what's so difficult and devastating is that it tends to be experienced as interpersonal failure. You know, and people feel very self-conscious when they're lonely, and they get really focused on social cues because they feel they don't belong and they need to belong. And the kinds of thoughts that might be, I didn't have anything in common with the people I met. Well, it's been my experience, especially in later life, that I can find something in common with anybody. I never have anything interesting to say. Imagine feeling like that anything you had to say was no interest. And I find this particularly troubling, that loneliness triggers a downward spiral. So if you're lonely, you tend to withdraw more, to become more sensitive to criticism. You know, when you're not feeling lonely, you can brush off a lot of criticism or minimize it. But if you're lonely, you become really sensitive, feeling more uneasy around other people, and losing some of your social skills. You know, if you don't get to practice them by being part of a community of people, your social skills start to deteriorate. As my need for others intensified, I began to retreat from them. And how do other people view loneliness? Well, you should be able to fix that yourself. Never mind the social context that we're in. That's far more important than what we can do for ourselves. There is a stigma with people, for people who are lonely. You know, there must be something wrong with her that she doesn't have any friends. Well, that stigma, that's not true. There's a greater stigma if someone is lacking that intimate, emotional, supportive connection than if they're lacking social connection. So it's not uncommon for people to know all kinds of other people, but they don't have that close emotional connection that's so important. And when you're lonely, and certainly as a young woman, I was viewed this way sometimes, as cold, unfeeling, stuck up, hard to get to know. But I really treasure this quotation. The fact of loneliness and longing does not mean one has failed, but simply that one is alive. So what are some risk factors for loneliness? Oh my goodness, would you look at that list? Living alone, fewer children, caregiving, widowhood, lack of involvement in community or volunteer activities, poverty, chronic pain. Oh my goodness, look at this, disability or mobility problems. Incontinence, imagine if you're leaking pee or poo that maybe you wouldn't want to be with other people. It'd be embarrassing. Lack of access to public transportation, loss of social roles as outlets for purposeful and meaningful activity. One of the things I learned in occupational therapy that the more roles you have, the more resilient you are. And if you think about all the different roles you have in your life, you know, a parent, a sibling, a child, a caregiver, a quilter, a sewer, a carpenter, a plumber, a Mr. Fix-It, a greeter, like all kinds of things fit into our roles. And as we lose those roles, we may become more lonely. So how do you identify if somebody is lonely? I was walking up Sussex Street one day and on my way home, and I stopped to chat with a woman I know who was out raking leaves in her front yard. And we had a good little chat for maybe 5 minutes. And then I said, you know, I've got things to do. I'm on my way. So I started to walk home. And she was walking right along with me. And she kept on chatting, and I kept on walking, and she kept on chatting. And we hadn't been discussing anything important, just, you know, general chit chat. And she walked with me all the way up to the top of the hill until we got to the end of the block before she finally took her leave and went back home. And I was thinking about this on the way home, and then I thought, oh, Marjorie, she lost her husband suddenly a couple of months ago. She's lonely. Prolonged holding of your hand or arm. Maybe you had the experience of visiting a grandparent or a very elderly person, and they want you to sit beside them, and they hold your arm or they hold your hand, and they kind of hang on, and you feel like you can't detach yourself, that they need to hang on to you. That's a clue that they're lonely. This was work done in Manchester, England. Defeated demeanor, tightly crossed arms or legs, and you can imagine that somebody's kind of all curled in on themselves. And withdrawal from social contact, which I mentioned earlier. So the lonelier you get, the less you seek social contact. Crying and depression. So my first job as an occupational therapist was in Moncton City Hospital, and all my family was in Alberta, and all my friends were in Alberta. And I can remember I used to wake up in the morning and I would cry, and then I'd get up and I'd go to work. And then the next morning I'd cry, and then I'd get up and go to work. And if you'd asked me why I was crying, I don't know that I knew or could have said. But looking back, I think I was desperately lonely. So what helps at the individual level? So gaining that sense of belonging. I knew a man who didn't learn to read until he was in his 50s. And he said to me one day, "Now I feel like I belong." Finding a mate. About a year after I was married, I remember a young man asked me what it felt like to be married. And I thought about it and I said, I feel an overwhelming sense of relief. I found a mate. Fitting into a group. So I tell this to people, if you find a group that interests you and you think you'd like to go, and you go to a few meetings and you know, they still don't treat you like you're part of the group, you maybe still don't really feel like you belong. Well, the people who are in the group who are receiving you, research shows that they need to see you turn up at least 7 times before they think of you as a member of the group. So I say, just hang in there and keep showing up. Gaining validation or acceptance. My husband, this probably would have been in my 50s sometime. My husband called me upstairs one morning. He was watching something on YouTube, and he said, "I think you should see this." And as I watched it, I started to cry, because it was the first time I had ever felt validated as an introvert. It was Susan Cain talking about her book, Quiet, the Power of Introvert People in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And she changed my life. Learning the dominant language, welcoming lots of people from other countries who don't speak English, and it must be really hard to feel they belong, at least until they learn the language. And having help to move out of poverty. So there's research that this is from Michael Marmot's work. He's the guy who did all that exploration of health in the British civil service. But he said if we can help lone parents with a lot of support in the first 5 years of their child's life, that they stand a much better chance of being integrated into society. So overcoming loneliness is a process, not a step. So when I first, you know, I told you about working at Moncton City Hospital, and then eventually I went to university at Dalhousie. And the first 6 months after I met Martin, who eventually became my husband, I cried for the first 6 months. And many years later, I heard a woman on the radio talking about marriage and relationships. And she said that when she first was getting to know her husband, she cried for the first 6 months. And I thought, oh, good, I'm not weird after all. Because it does take time to go from feeling lonely to feeling like you belong. So what helps at the individual level? Well, there are several things that seem to help. So increasing opportunities for social interaction, and that means also in-line interaction, improving a person's communication skills, helping them to seek counseling or joining support groups. All those things seem to be helpful, but what's 4 times more effective is to challenge lonely thoughts and change negative expectations. And this changes how we feel, which changes how we act. So I find that fascinating. When you think about it, those things like nobody would be interested in what I have to say, I don't have anything in common with other people, those, you know, a couple of things I mentioned earlier. Well, those are negative thoughts. So changing those negative thoughts is more important and more effective than these other strategies. I'm not saying we shouldn't do these other strategies, but we also have to challenge negative thinking. Making new friends. So I was phoned by a woman I know who's doing some research, and after she'd interviewed me, we just got chatting. And we got talking about, if we happen to die if our husbands die before we do, and statistically speaking, there's a good chance that will happen, especially if your husband is a number of years older. That doesn't mean it will happen, but it's more likely it will happen. And she said that one of the things she was doing was paying more attention to developing friendships and strengthening the friendships she did have. And I said, so am I. So that's one of the things I'm doing. It's really, and COVID, in fact, just made it easier because I kind of have an excuse now to phone the odd friend here and there, maybe once a month or a couple of times a month, just to see how they're doing and what have you been up to, and just making a connection that I never bothered with before COVID. So in that sense, it helped me. So to make new friends, there are 3 requirements, and this is harder than you might think. So repeated unplanned interactions, proximity. If you bump into them frequently, then there's more opportunity to have unplanned interactions, like walking up the hill and chatting with the woman raking her leaves, and a setting that encourages people to let their guard down and confide in each other. So I would suggest start small. You don't pour out everything that's in there right off the bat, but a few sensitive things and see how the other person responds. So I'm keeping that in mind as I work to develop friendships. I have lost friends, some by death, others through sheer inability to cross the street. And it does take emotional energy to make the effort to develop friendships. When we were young, it was as easy as falling off a log, but as we get older, it can be a bit more difficult and challenging. So it takes a bit more energy. And what helps at the neighborhood or community level? So we've talked about social ties, those people and so on. And they're very pleasurable and they matter. They make you feel like, you're part of the community. But there's also the social support, and that's multifaceted. And I think of it as people need wraparound support. So we need emotional support, people who care about us and people who we love. Tangible aid and services. It's, driving you to the grocery store. My husband and I haven't owned a car since 2007, so we really rely on other people now and again for a drive once in a while. And we're very lucky we have a friend who, whenever she goes away, she lets us use her car. Informational support, advice, suggestions, information. Oh, do you know about the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia? That would be an example. And appraisal, information useful for self-evaluation. So that's what I was given by staff at the Alzheimer's Society when I was, I'll be talking to people who have dementia or who are caregivers for people with dementia. And I don't know how helpful this would be. And they were saying, oh, it will be helpful, Marjorie. Don't worry about it. It was good stuff. You just make sure you say it. So, but that's those are 4 pieces of social support that we all need. And if we're relying on just one person for all of that, then if they die, then we're really in trouble. So we have to explore other avenues. What helps at the neighborhood and community level? So in New Zealand, they have a service provided 24/7 by volunteers who receive 60 hours of training, and their job is to listen. So you can phone them up about anything in your life that you want to talk about. I think that would go such a long way to addressing loneliness and mental health. Just somebody to listen. Here in Nova Scotia, we have South Shore Helping Hands, where people who need help are matched with people who want to offer help. Daily check-in by phone or email or visit. So every morning there are two women I know, both of whom live alone, who we email each other every morning. And if I don't hear from, like the woman who lives just over the hill, then I phone her cell phone. And if I still don't get a response, then I go and look in the garage and see if I can see her car. And if her car is gone, I don't worry. But if her car is there, then I bang on the door. And if I need to, I have a key and I can go in and check on her. And that's a great comfort to her. I heard of one community where men and women who are runners and go out running several times a week also include a stopover with some elderly person or somebody who's lonely, just to have a 15 or 20 minute chin wag, and then they carry on running. My daughter, who's a runner, really likes that idea. St. Paul's United Church in Spryfield offers community meals. And belonging to a church or synagogue or mosque or temple, it is very powerful in helping to reduce loneliness if you're inclined that way. We have community connections in Nova Scotia that seek to support older adults in multiple ways. And I love the idea of men's sheds. These are places where men can go to do projects or borrow tools or hang out and drink coffee or go out into the neighborhood and do some community project. I would really like to see that in Spryfield where I live. I don't know if I'm going to make it happen, but I really like the idea. And we have 211 across Nova Scotia. There's no requirement to give your Medicare number or your personal information. You can be completely anonymous, and they can help direct you to services that may support what you need. The World Health Organization has developed a lot of tools and a framework for age-friendly communities. You know, how to make outdoor spaces and buildings better for older adults. And what works better for 80-year-olds works better for 8-year-olds too. And here in Nova Scotia, it used to be that all communities were not required to do any community planning. And so Department of Seniors, working with Municipal Affairs, worked to develop a policy such that communities in Nova Scotia are now required to do some community planning. Well, if they're required to do some community planning, then there's a better opportunity to encourage them to develop age-friendly communities. So that's how something that happens at the policy level can go down and make a difference at the community level. Nova Scotia's Action Plan for an Aging Population covers 3 main areas. Value the economic and social contribution of older adults. So that would be things like working with businesses and local companies to encourage more graduated retirement, where people, you know, maybe stop coming to work every day or just for a few hours a day, or maybe they do a contract work for 3 months and then they're off for a while. Promote healthy, active living. It used to be, just a few short years ago, that there was so much provincial money put into the hands of recreation centers for youth recreation that they had trouble spending it all. Dear me. And so some of that money was earmarked instead for supporting recreation among older adults. So that's helpful. I'm just giving you little snippets. There were all kinds of things that have happened under these 3 major goals. And support older adults to age in place and connected to community. Well, there's some wonderful work being done to how to redesign care homes to be more home-like and to encourage and make easier social interactions, rather than it being built like a hospital with long hallways and individual rooms and one toilet shared among multiple people. They're completely redesigning what care homes can be like, so that we don't have to worry in our old age, or if we're caring for someone with dementia, that they're going to be in some horrible place in their later years. And the importance of building care homes that are close to community, that are part of community. Too often they get built at the edges of communities, and then it's harder for there to be a connection between people living in a care home and people in the community. So those are just little snippets from the overall shift report. And what about you making a difference? So there's a new book out. It's published in November by McGill Queens, and it's called Without Compassion, There Is No Healthcare. I asked the public library system to order it, and they have, but it hasn't come yet, but I'm going to read it, and I will be very disappointed if it doesn't include social well-being, because being more compassionate helps to reduce loneliness. I would love to see social well-being accreditation for all institutional care. For goodness sakes, we can tell you if somebody has had a bowel movement today and what their temperature is, but do we know how to measure their social well-being? It's not being done. But the professional voice matters. So I was at a talk once given by a pharmacist, and he had talked about the problem of non-compliance in taking medication. And I asked the question, you know, did he have some idea of what proportion of non-compliance was due to people living in poverty? And his answer was, oh, that's political. I don't do that. And I was so disappointed, and I was annoyed, because the professional voice does make a difference. And as citizens of the world, we have some responsibility to take action on matters that matter to us. Obviously, it didn't matter to him. And citizenship and advocacy. I just want to make sure I see what I wanted to do in. Yes, okay. So citizenship and advocacy. So being an advocate doesn't mean that you have to beat your chest and speak in a loud voice. Being an advocate is simply about saying out loud what you think is important. So I was at some event that the Spryfield Business Commission had put on. And after words, I was chatting with one of the local businessmen, and he said something about all those damn immigrants moving to Nova Scotia. And I had to challenge him, but in a way that wouldn't make him defensive. So I just said, oh, I don't know. I kind of like the idea of different kinds of people mixing together. And then we moved on and talked other things. But I know him. And that might not change his mind, but he'll remember that I said it. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we actually make more heartwarming connections in our personal life and in our professional life. And one of the frameworks that I found really helpful is the 5 love languages, which was developed by a psychologist named Gary Chapman. So physical touch. And I want you to think about, of these 5 love languages, which one do you prefer, or which ones do you prefer? And which ones do your partner prefer? And which ones do your clients and patients prefer? Do you even know? So physical touch, hugs, pats on the back, arm, shoulder, holding hands. Oh, I love to be touched. But you have to be careful. We had painters in for a while, and one day one of them was trying to show me something, and he was pointing up there, and I couldn't quite see what he said, so I moved over so I could see better, and he moved over some more, and And so I moved over some more because I still couldn't see what he was talking about. And he finally said, I don't like to be touched. Oh, and I realized that my shoulder was touching him as I was moving to try and see what he was. And he wasn't moving for me to see better. He was moving to get away from me. So I just put that in. Not everybody likes to be hugged, you know. Words of affirmation, compliments, and reasons for loving, the things that make you feel really good about yourself. And that's kind of where my husband and I are. We both like words of affirmation. You know, if he says, I am blessed to have a wife who knows how to cook, well, he's got me wrapped around his little finger to keep on cooking. Gifts, love, and thoughtfulness behind the gift. Our daughter, Kate, is really good at picking out gifts that show how much she understands the person. So one day my husband and I had built a house to see us into our very old age. And I was out shopping one day for something and I ran across a display of dish towels. And I thought, oh, it would be nice to have a new dish towel for our new house. So I sorted through them and I picked out one and I thought, I'll give this to my husband for a gift. Well, you might be thinking, what kind of wife would give her husband a dish towel? But I knew he really liked it because his face went all soft when he read the words on the dish towel, which said, what I love most about my home is who I share it with. And acts of service. So my older daughter has 2 little boys, and anything I can do to ease her responsibilities, like preparing a meal or doing some mending or knitting some slippers or doing anything to help her with mommy duties, makes her feel loved. Quality time and undivided attention. So just spending time with someone. I know if my husband is sitting in the living room drinking a cup of tea or coffee, I'm quite happy to be in the corner reading a book, but I know it matters to him to share things. So I make the effort and I go and sit in the living room and with him, you know, in a comfy chair for me too, because I know it makes him feel loved and treasured. Thinking about gifts, I have a friend who, well, I've known her for over 20 years, and every 4 or 5 years, she'll give me something, you know, like a pretty mug or some nice lotion. And it finally dawned on me that Donna feels loved when she receives gifts. So I have finally started giving her little gifts now and again. So it's not what the other person needs. It's not what you need, it's what the other person needs. Okay, and there's a wonderful book by Sonia Yubel-Mercy called The How of Happiness, and she talks about the importance of micro connection. And I'll just give you some examples. And we can all cultivate those moments of close connection to make people feel that emotional closeness. So it's not so much what you do, as how you do it. So I remember a quite elderly woman coming to a meeting one day and all excited about having gone to the bank. Well, it wasn't anything that the bank did for her. It was the way a young man held the door open for her at the bank and made her feel special. I can remember getting off the bus one day on Barrington Street and then going down to Hollis Street. And I wasn't sure which direction I needed to walk to get to the hotel where the meeting was. But as I was walking along, I came up behind a couple who were headed in the same direction. And I asked them if they knew where the hotel was. And it was, yes, the direction we were both going. So I thanked them and I kept on walking, and then I finally got to the hotel and I turned around and they were quite far back, so too far away for me to say anything. But I stuck my hand up in the air as if to say, thanks, I found the place. And what was so lovely when the man in the pair stuck up his hand as if to say, "You're welcome, I'm glad I could help." So that was a micro connection. And this is one of my favorites. For a couple of months last winter, I was taking the first bus of the day 2 mornings a week, and it didn't take the bus driver long to know that when I got on the bus, I put in a ticket and I'd ask for a transfer. And, and we would smile at each other and say good morning and how are you and some comment. And, I really liked this young man. But one day I got on the bus and put in my ticket and he didn't give me a transfer. So I had to say, "I'd like a transfer, please." So he put out his hands towards me like this. I hope you can see. And he opened them up and there was my transfer. Well, I felt like a princess all day. So think about the interactions that you have, and are there some micro connections that you can make? So I guess my questions for you are, what stands out for you in all that I've been talking about? What resonates most with you? And I'd like to know what you might do, what you think you might do to reduce loneliness. And as we heard earlier, if you have questions you want to put into the chat, we can get to those too. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can get to having conversation. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marjorie. What a beautiful presentation. What just a lovely way. I said to Beth as we were looking for answering our questions that were coming in, and I just said, what a beautiful presentation. You have a beautiful way of providing such lovely information in such a honest and beautiful, truthful way. And so I thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much. So do we have some questions or comments?
So our first question came in, and it was about one of the slides that you had a little bit back, and I think it was slide number about 17, and it talked about what helps at the individual level, and what sort of the second part of it is, help at the individual level and more help at the individual level. So the question came in and it said, you talked about these suggestions, and can you tell me, are they the same kind of suggestions that you would provide to people sort of across all ages, or are they more specific to older adults?
So because my focus these days is on older adults, they're probably focused more on older adults. But I have also learned that no matter what age you are, you still need the same basic social ties and social connections. And of course, what might help a 5-year-old may be very different from what would help a 95-year-old. So I guess the answer is you have to do, I'm focused more on older adults.
Right. We did have a lovely comment come in that I wanted to share with you. So the comment said, "Thank you for talking about loneliness. No one ever talks about it, but so many people are affected."
Yes.
Right. And we don't recognize, I think, often enough, especially, when everything happened and our world kind of shifted on its axis a bit and COVID came in, the impact, especially on our older population, which is kind of what we're talking more about today, the impact of loneliness. So that kind of rolls into a question that had come through that said, what would be some of your suggestions about how someone who's living alone, and even that person who has dementia that's living alone, how could we help them, with that social isolation and that loneliness feeling?
Reaching out in any way that you can, whether it's, a carefully monitored 6-foot difference in their home when you go to see them with a mask on, or a daily phone call, or taking them out for a walk. It's so hard to know, like, what did that person used to enjoy? And is there some way that you can help them reconnect to what they used to enjoy? Right. So maybe people never went for a walk and you say, well, I'm going to take you for a walk today. it may not be what works for them.
Yeah. And that's a really great point, because one of those things we always say to people is we want purposeful and meaningful activity.
Yeah.
Because if I never enjoyed baking and suddenly you want me to make tea biscuits with you, um, that may not be something that is of interest to me, and it may not bring joy to me because it's not something that I enjoy. I think it's really important, especially if we talk about, social isolation and loneliness and dementia. Sometimes what we have to do is we have to provide ideas of support. So maybe it means something like having a Zoom call with, one or two people so that your person can see some faces. And maybe it means, sending over a care package of activity to do. I know the Alzheimer's Society has programs like Artful Afternoon, where you're on a Zoom call, but with your person and your person who has dementia, you're able to create a beautiful piece of artwork. So there's things that we can do to help connect, even in this sort of social isolation of COVID. Here's an interesting comment that came through, and it says, my person has been placed in long-term care, and now I'm alone at home, and I'm very lonely, and I'm not able to see them like I used to.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. I hear that over and over and over. And I know that different care homes have slightly different ways of encouraging that. And so working with the care home, I think, to figure out what would work in that situation. And getting back to an earlier point about the kinds of activities, one of the things that continuing care has talked about is the social history that would go with anybody who's moving into a care home or moving between institutions. So what kind of music did they used to like? What kind of activities did they like to do? And so on. And so for somebody who's left alone at home because a spouse has gone into care, I would ask, sometimes you have to go all the way back to childhood. What are the things that you used to love to do?
Yeah.
And people forget that, I was thinking about this, and I can remember as a girl, I was probably 10, maybe, something like that. And I dug up a wild rose because I wanted to grow it in my backyard. Well, me, gardening has been part of my life all these years, but it was going back to what I enjoyed as a child that I find really helpful for people to start to care for themselves and find activities that give them purpose and meaning.
Yeah. And the Alzheimer's Society has a beautiful tool, and it's called the All About Me book. And the All About Me book is really made for, a care partner and the person with dementia to kind of fill out together, so that when a transition in care happens, it talks about those long ago stories, those long ago things that are lovely. We have the ability to go back and reach, but maybe in the process of doing that for the person with dementia, and you're doing it with them, you can also do it for yourself, so that, you can find the things that used to bring you joy when you were young. We have them in English, we have them in French, and we also have a First Nations booklet called The Story Is Mine. And so being able to connect and access those can be really nice as well.
Yes, and also in the other direction, things you've always wanted to do and never had the chance. Apparently, it's quite common for older adults to start to take music lessons.
Yeah.
And to learn to play an instrument.
Yeah.
So just because you missed out on something as a young person, maybe that's a clue that you can do it now.
Yeah.
And I do have a bit of a confession to make. I do sometimes find myself thinking, well, if I didn't have a husband, I think I would. But I think that's very healthy, because it says I can imagine a life afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think I'll give you this one as our last question. It came through the chat and it says, you mentioned the benefit of a social well-being accreditation. Is there an accreditation in Canada?
Oh, if you mean a social accreditation, I have no idea. But all institutions have to go through some sort of accreditation. Like the
Yes.
Nova Scotia Health System is in delivery is starting another accreditation process.
Yes.
But I would like to see more emphasis on social well-being, not just physical well-being.
Yes. Well, Marjorie, it has been a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. I say to everybody, you know, that always attends, and for anybody that, you know, shares the topic that they were here today, after we finish today, the video itself, we'll do a little bit of trimming work to it, and then it gets placed on our YouTube channel. So please, if you were able to take in the presentation today and you feel like it would be beneficial for someone else, please don't hesitate to send them along to take advantage of the YouTube recorded video of our presentation. As always, if anybody needs to talk, if you have questions or concerns, if you need help in any way, please don't hesitate. You can always reach out to the Alzheimer's Society. We have a team that support, you know, through the information line. And by calling our 1-800 number at 1-800-611-6345, you can connect to our supports, and Beth is our behind the scenes. Beth there has put up our slide there to allow people to see that number. And so please don't hesitate to reach out, or if you know someone that could use some help through the Alzheimer's Society, whether it's just to talk things out, we're here to help and we're here for you. So please, please call that number. So once again, Marjorie, thank you for your time and your talent and your knowledge this afternoon. It was a pleasure and a joy to have you with us. And we are so thankful that you joined us.
It was a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.